I'd say 30 years to pretty much the present. The arcades have been relegated to the back rooms and the side streets, and generally been an unsavory type of place. What we want to do is bring the amusement game to age. If we can give it a new zip and a pizzazz, it's going to be financially successful, as well as, I think, a very serious part in the leisure time activity of the American people.
The marriage of traditional pinball machines and computer technology has resulted in the birth of a new breed of amusement games. And Nolan Bushnell is the man handing out the cigars. Bushnell has developed two such games, Computer Space and Pong, and believes that they and others like them will move the pinball industry out of America's bus stations and bowling alleys and into the space age. In 1971, Bushnell invented Computer Space, but sold production rights to Nutting Associates of Mountain View, California, for royalties based on the number of games sold. It proved a good deal for both parties. Sales already exceed 1,500 machines. Computer Space, like Pong, sells for around $1,000 and is played on the screen of a standard television set, which has been programmed to display the desired game. In Computer Space, the player controls a rocket ship, which is trying to shoot down enemy flying saucers while avoiding their missiles. If the player scores more hits than the enemy saucers, he gets one free play. By the time Bushnell invented Pong in 1972, he was able to form his own company, Syzygy Corporation in Santa Clara, California, to produce the game. He has already sold over 1,000 machines and expects to sell 10,000 in the United States by the end of the year. Pong, as the name might indicate, is a game of video ping pong. The two players turn dials which control their electronic paddles and volley with an equally electronic ball. The first player to score 15 points wins. While Bushnell did design and program both his games, the technology he uses dates back to the late 1950s. Thanks to research by the Defense Department in the wake of Sputnik, Bushnell is now able to act out his dream of a nation inhabited by thousands of Pong and Computer Space games.
The government spent millions of dollars on this technology, and as a result, now it's cheap enough that we can put it into a game and sell it for 25 cents for a few minutes and make $1 out of it. It's something that the research and development really was done many years ago, and now it's cheap enough that with PC boards and integrated circuits, we can use that technology to our advantage.
The basic electronic unit of Bushnell's games is the integrated circuit. Each of these small chips is capable of storing large amounts of information. The program for a game is determined by specific combinations of these units to form a PC, or printed circuit board. The printed circuit board then tells the TV screen what to do. A single printed circuit board is all that is required to operate Pong, whereas 15 years ago it would have taken enough tubes and wiring to fill an average house. Bushnell first saw the commercial potential of video games in a game called Space War, which has been played at computer centers around the country for several years.
We used to play Space War a lot at the AI project at Stanford, which is a big computer complex. And one day it just hit, this is a lot of fun, to be able to package it and sell it for a price. And, one thing leads to another, and pretty soon, from doodling on a scratch pad, you're actually working out some basic block diagrams, and from there you think, boy, it's going to work.
You know what the Atari motto is? Innovative leisure, right? Well, it didn't say innovative arcade games. It didn't say innovative video games. It said innovative leisure. It was broad from day one. I mean, Nolan always had a consumer game in his mind because that's what he hired me to do. And I wound up doing the wrong thing and making a hit coin-op game, right? When I was at Ampex, I learned how to make sync generators, synchronizing, the basic fundamental circuit necessary to get a TV signal, because we had to generate an analog signal. So you do that, and you get the ball at one speed, and you put paddles up, and it's a very, very boring game. And so I added the speed up, and I added the angles off of that, just, you know, to make it playable, interesting. And so it started getting a little interesting. That's cute. And Nolan said, well, it's got to have score. We had a pretty good game, and hey, great. So what are you going to do for sound? I go, sound? I'm already over budget. What am I going to do? Nolan said, well, I want the sound of a roar of a crowd of thousands applauding your win. And Ted said, I want boos and hisses. And I'm thinking, how do I do that? Listen, I got video. I got the goddamn game up. Now you wanted me to do this. I'll be right back. So I pissed around for a day and poked around sounds that already existed in the vertical sync generator and gated them out with the 555 timer. I love it. Years later, the sound is so well thought out, so appropriate. It was like, are you kidding me? It was just, you know, just thrown together in spite of what the boss said. And so that was how Pong came to be.
So everybody's heard the Pong story. Probably everybody's heard the Pong story, but I've heard it many times, and from Al Alcorn himself, who designed Pong. So,
the story I've heard is that they installed one of the first Pong machines in a tavern and let people play it as a test.
Put it out into an arcade and see if it makes money. I mean, that's the market research.
My understanding was Ted built a cabinet, a tabletop, simple cabinet over the weekend. And a coin mech bolted to the side of the cabinet, tabletop type of big thing was sit on a barrel.
Placing a interactive video machine somewhere and having people play it was still a relatively new concept. Nobody knew if it was going to go.
Oh, what is the name of the bar in Palo Alto?
San Jose?
No, it was Andy Caps.
It was Santa Clara?
Sunnyvale.
So we'll put it in Andy Caps. You know, it's a coin-op game, be it fragile and humble. And so we did.
Well, my memory is that he gets a phone call, the game's busted, which of course is the usual thing you get on a support line. It doesn't work. What is it, and in what way does it not work? Well, it doesn't work.
The bar owner or manager at the time kind of yelled at them and like accused them of their game being shoddy because it had already broken down and it was no longer functioning or working.
And they get a call, you know, later on that night and like, hey, this thing broke, you know. Come and pick up this piece of shit game and get it out of here. You know, this thing broke. You know, I'm not gonna waste my time fixing this crap.
But anyway, the machine, we got the word that it stopped working, and I figured it could be anything, and I'd go out there and take a look at it. And so I went to the machine, and the first thing you do is you want to try to play the game, because the machine was on in a tracked mode. So it was working, but you couldn't start a game. So you open up the coin box to basically flip the micro switch to give yourself a free game, because I'm not going to waste a quarter, you know.
And so they went down to see what's wrong with the machine to fix it, and what they found out was that it wasn't broken, it was just that so many people had played it, they'd filled the coin box with quarters, and it was jammed, and it couldn't take any more.
So many people had played it that it couldn't accept any more money.
The game is broken because it's stuffed so full of quarters.
Completely stuffed with quarters.
And it was a small, I remember it was kind of small, if I remember, it was a small space. It just filled up with the quarters and it wouldn't take it.
When I opened up the coin mech, you know, all these quarters just gushed out. So, whoa, that's impressive.
It's the equivalent of like crashing a server when you launch a new website and it's so popular. So they crashed the server on Pong.
And one of the other reasons it was also so popular is because you could play it with one hand while you're still holding a pint in your other hand. And that also was one of those things that, you know, eventually many, many years later led to the rise of the fun barcades that we have, you know, and we can enjoy now.
as Al will always say with a little, you know, twinkle in his eye, he goes, "This is a problem I can fix."
Basically, the way it worked was you take the money, the deal you have, and you split the take with the owner of the bar. And so I did that, and I had this sack of quarters, and the next day I come into work and I said, I got the machine fixed, and here's the problem. Goddamn thing's making too much money. And really?
But it was one of those great moments where something that supposedly was failing was actually such a huge success that no one could recognize. It was truly the ugly duckling version of technology.
Because remember, Nolan thought, he was like, this is just a placeholder until we get to design the really good game, because who's going to play this stupid shit-ass game?
They went on to produce all of these classic, memorable arcade titles for years that allowed the company to survive and be so much more than a one-hit wonder. So that's my understanding of the history of Pong.
It's a great story if it's true.
When a story is good, you know there's some doubt about it. Like, oh, that's too good to be really true. It's probably a boring version of it that's actually true.
It sounds realistic to me. I mean, I've kind of seen that happen in my own. And when you do get a really great game, the coins will just overflow, and it's kind of a cool feeling.
Anyway, that's how that all happened. Yeah. Anyway.
I mean, Atari really, why were they in the pinball business? Here they had this tiger by the tail of video games, just this supernova of creativity and possibilities, and, they were nailing it left and right, creating new genres every other week. Why would you mess around with pinball? You could tell our games were just not working, and due to reliability, poor engineering, thermal issues, issues of the games just falling apart, poor hardware design. I could see the writing was on the wall that we were going to go down. I mean, the pinball division was just a massive disaster. I mean, it was, it's kind of the, kind of the hubris of, I guess Silicon Valley, even in that era, where it's like, oh, these morons in Chicago, they make these crappy old games, we're going to redesign everything. We're going to put the display down in the bottom. We're going to, put the boards, underneath the play field so all the crap falls in and shorts out the things. And I mean, it was really horrific design, and they caught on fire. And, the solenoids, they used this thing called rotary solenoids, which burned up and the screws fell out. And, it was kind of a, just a complete disaster as far as like design and also testing. And so there was a lot of games that caught on fire in the early days. So, but they made a lot of money when they were working. We did. I think the programming was awesome because I did it.
You will hear stories of hot tubs in the lobby and drug use in the office. And I'm here to tell you that none of that happened in my department.
We started smoking pot right in our office. Rob and I were like the premier pot. Sorry, Rob. I and some other person who occasionally shared an office with me for 5 years at Atari, however that frickin' worked, we would just fire up right in the office. It's like, who knows why? It's like, it's illegal. It's like, it wasn't even a sense of privilege. It was just mindlessness.
I worked in a satellite office. I started in 1977, which was still pretty early. It was only 18 months since the 2600 came out. But there was no hot tub in the lobby of the office that I went to. There was no drug use in Atari, though I don't doubt that it was over where Howard and Todd Fry were working.
Drugs were consumed at Atari by all kinds of people at all levels of management, from the bottom to the top and all over engineering. Not everybody did drugs, but some people did, and some people enjoyed them, and some people abused them, and some people went to the hospital on them. And, but by and large, drugs were a relatively nominal factor. Drugs, you know, there was a lot of marijuana, and it participated a lot in brainstormings. So we had the way of, you know, trying to incorporate drugs into our productivity model.
I went home and I smoked a joint, a little bit of cocaine and a little bit of psilocybin in it. And I was sitting there, it was about half gone when I realized, oh, you could do that. And it's like I put it out and I went and I wrote a page of notes. And my design for that kernel was exactly what it ended up shipping. It was like, it has a tremendous amount of effort, actually, to get everything organized.
You know, they did have good deliveries of cannabis in the inter-office mail. You know, that was probably the primary use of those yellow manila envelopes. So I think it was, you know, Fridays or Monday. I think it was Fridays when you get these really thick envelopes coming through the system. And, you know, and it was weird. It was like there was a guy working there, and his job was he was the weed dealer. You know, that was his sole job at the whole company.
And there was a very straight German VP of hardware down the hallway in the building. I have no idea. And he complained to management about the smell of pot smoke in the corridors. So they got him an office in a different building.
I have been asthmatic since I've been 12. I need drugs to breathe. I did not do drugs because drugs to me were something that let you get up in the morning, you know, and breathe. So and nor did I think I wanted to mix those things. The high of me was doing the work, and I was always a happy guy. So I just didn't feel I needed it. So I never did drugs, but there were a lot there.
Don't put too much stock in the fact that every Atari employee was stoned out of their minds while making games.
I mean, there was all kinds of drugs consumed at Atari, but the real drug at Atari was going into a store and seeing your product, seeing your game on a shelf.
When was this? 1980, 81, that time frame. Prior to Ray Kassar's emergence, I was part of the executive staff, you know, and Nolan, Joe, I, Steve Bristow, Gil, Dennis Groth, finance, you know, we were all friends and no politics and all that, and we all worked together and part of the team. It was great. Once Ray took over, nope, it was all a closed office, and he met with all his hires from Procter & Gamble, and so I realized, okay, I'm out of this. I'm either going to have to quit because Nolan had gone, Joe had gone, Lipkin, everybody had gone. I figured, well, I'll go back. This is my baby. I'm going to do it one more time. And we had used holography. We couldn't keep secrets at Atari. We're just no good at it. So we decided the best thing to do was put out disinformation. So one of the best ones was the next coin-op game is going to have holography in it. It was like, what the hell is that? I knew what it was, because having, you know, been to college and studied this physics and stuff. But that was just, but anyway, I decided, well, I'll do something, let's do something in holography. Maybe there's something there. I'll take it. Sounds hard, sounds interesting. I know a little bit about it. And we proceeded to explore holography and what could be done, and came up with a holographic toy that basically sold it to Ray, saying, how would you like, because the cartridge video game business seemed to be very good. How would you like to have a system where the cartridge, it's a cartridge-based system, but the cartridges are half the cost of, everything is half the cost of the VCS. And, hey, go ahead. It were very simple. They were nothing more than an LED, a simple LED game, the handheld LED game in those days. The only difference was we had a hologram with 2 images on it. You look through this box, and there were 2 lamps inside, and when you'd crash a spaceship, you'd see a hologram of a spaceship crashing. And but you could look through this half metallized mylar and play a Space Invader game or something like that. We did all the work, put everything together, got a chip designed, package designed, and at the end, Ray wouldn't. We even took it to the toy fair or the consumer. And marketing wouldn't show it, wouldn't back it up, and we did it ourselves, engineering. And we think we sold 100,000 of them, but Ray would not release it, just wouldn't do it. And I realized that was it. They're not going to release that. I mean, this is now in a time when if it failed, you wouldn't even notice it. It wouldn't be a pimple on the balance sheet. But they were afraid to do it. Back when the whole company was, we're sure we'd do it. So that was the end of my career at Atari.
On the simplest level, what the VCS, the Atari 2600, what that is, it's a combination of plastic and computer chips that enables you to play a video game, an interactive video game on your home television, which is something that never really happened before.
If you're making an arcade game, it begins as a hardware project. If you need something more in the hardware, just put it in the hardware and you can use it in your game. The Atari 2600, we didn't have that luxury. The game was already in Grandma's house. It was already hooked up to her TV. And all we could do is make a different cartridge, sell that to the person, he plugs it in.
It was the thing that made video games a worldwide phenomenon. And all it is it's a box that enables you to play an interactive game on your TV. But on a cultural level, that's such a huge thing to do, because there were 2 things that achieved that changed the world, literally changed the world. One is it put computers in homes. At a time where IBM only had about 10,000 PCs sold altogether, Atari had millions of units installed, and every one of those was a computer in the home. The other thing it did was it created an interactive medium with television, which was always a passive medium. Before video games, people were just zombies sitting on the couch watching TV. But video games turned people into zombies jumping up and down on the couch yelling at the TV. And that was a very different experience. And I think that was huge in terms of taking people from a passive state to an active state. And we're still learning the implications of that.
The entire reason that Atari created the Atari 2600 home console was to put their arcade hits into the home. If we can sell home versions of our arcade hit games into the home, we can sell millions of them instead of just take quarters from the thousands of people who go to arcades. And so the hardware was designed to make it possible to play Tank and Pong. That's about all that they did in the hardware.
So the distinction is this. CoinUp gets to use more expensive hardware. They get to use tons and tons of hardware, and they get to refresh their hardware all the time.
I had played an Outlaw-like game in the arcade, I think it was Midway, and you know, I was just told to make a game, so I said, well, here's an idea, two guys shooting at each other, and so I made that game. My goal is to try to make it like the arcade game, so I could look at the arcade game and say, this is what it has to do. So there really wasn't any need for me to have communication with the arcade guys. I'm particularly proud of the Atari 2600 Canyon Bomber because it also has the Atari arcade game Depth Charge in it. So it turns out that in a 2K byte Atari 2600 cartridge, I simulated both Canyon Bomber and Depth Charge, which were probably $3,000 arcade game hardware.
When I was young, when I was little, I remember there was this drugstore, and in their comic book rack, they had these abridged versions of great literature. You'd read it, and it was the whole story of Treasure Island. War and Peace, a comic book. But that whole notion of an abridged version, that is what was going to happen.
When I did Donkey Kong, I had, not surprisingly, absolutely no contact with Nintendo. Coleco was able to get me a machine. So I had a machine that I could play and look at, and I had already played the game. And like David said, with Canyon Bomber, the game is the spec. Frankly, the hardware is so different in its capabilities that I can't think of any value I would have had getting in touch with anybody at Nintendo. It's like talking to the guy who created the Porsche Carrera about making a bicycle. I mean, it's like, there's not a lot there. Not a lot you're gonna tell me. Here's this masterpiece and do it on this toaster, you know, and I was young enough and stupid enough to not be intimidated. And I wasn't because I was just a kid. And I was like, no big deal.
I'd have to say one of the more influential Atari games that hit me hard was Adventure.
Adventure had been a very popular game. Adventure is related to really a nerdy game. It's related to like text adventures or to Dungeons and Dragons more than any of the other things, any of the other intellectual property or content on the 2600.
So many games were just like kind of shooters and, you know, combat and whatnot, things like that that were very simple. But Adventure really broke the mold for what the 2600 was capable of.
But one of the most like I feel like magical, impactful moments on me with the Atari games is that we got Adventure, and I saw the cover at the drugstore, because that's where we had to buy video games, at the drugstore behind the photo counter. And we got it home. I was so excited to play it. I just didn't read the instructions. I just ripped it out of the box and played it and started playing it. And I was like, oh, and there's Dot, and there's the duck chasing me, and I got an arrow, and I can't figure out what's happening. He ate me. Oh my God.
The weird thing about Adventure was the dragons were supposed to be dragons, but they just looked like ducks. I don't know what they were thinking there.
The bridge and the bat, and it was so baffling. I really loved that experience of somewhat confused experience, and I feel like that's actually something I love still in games now, when there's that moment of like, what the, where you just get, games can do that. They can just surprise you, and they can make you feel really bewildered, and then as you slowly figure out how they work, that's part of the pleasure of them, I think, is that not knowing what to expect in them. So that moment of being surprised by Adventure has really stuck with me. Another thing I like about Adventure that I try to incorporate is that feeling that the game is really alive. The characters who are in that world live even when you're not looking at them on the screen. Like when the dragon or the bat flies on the screen in Adventure, you feel like it's been on a journey. It's been somewhere. Oh, the bat went over and it stole the shield. No, it stole the sword, and now it's in the rooms. Like, you don't feel like it was just spawned in that room. It's been in another room doing bat adventures.
And what it provided for me was a sense of mystery and exploration that would later influence the 2D adventure games that I would make that would help launch my career.
So one of the first questions they asked me at Atari was, what do you want to work on? So I just said to him, I said, what's the dirtiest, most basic elemental system that you have? And he goes, oh, well, that's the VCS. And I said, well, that's where I want to start.
I mean, the constraints on the programmers were worse than I ever even imagined were possible.
2600 doesn't draw a screen. It doesn't draw anything. What it does is it has these little logic devices, these counters and shift registers that say, this is the start of the screen, this is the left side of the screen. The electron beam is moving to the right. I'm going to count. I know how fast the electron beam is moving. I'm going to count until the electron beam is somewhere on the screen, and then I'm going to change the color on the screen for a little itsy bit.
There's only one console where you have to think about the electron gun moving across the screen and what machine cycle you're on and when you can show stuff on the screen. That's such a fun and unique and annoying challenge that it really hooks you.
It's the most fun I've ever had making a game. What do you say, Dave?
Fun might not be the word. You know, it is the most challenging thing you could do. When we were doing it at Atari and at Activision, there were fewer than 100 people in the world who could do what we were doing. And that in itself was, you know, very positive, very uplifting. It's really a sense of accomplishment. If you can create something that, you know, 1 million people love on this horribly limited piece of hardware, you've created something. You know, have a sense of accomplishment.
And there are very few things more technical challenging than trying to get a game out of the VCS in the first place, because the VCS was a very technically limited machine. It sounds like a fabulous thing, and when it first came out, it was, because people had never seen anything like it.
I don't know if other people are as rewarded by it, but you're overcoming tremendous challenges. There's nothing that's easy to do on the 2600. And you're winning, right? I love winning.
And the other thing that's fun about playing them still is that they're all 60 frames a second. They have to hit that or the screen won't draw, you know? So they're all even much better than I think consoles that came out a few years afterwards. They all feel really fast when you play them. No Atari game has any sort of lag or anything because they had no option to have lag.
It's like when today, in hindsight, people criticize the first screen of Donkey Kong on the 2600. When I finished that screen, I thought it was a miracle. And you get people on Facebook today saying it's the biggest piece of junk I ever saw. And you just have to understand the perspective of where you were at the time.
The programmers that worked with that machine were magicians.
A fly. I'll have a mutant fly. Hello, Yar. You'll need some protection. Ion zone. Shift chroma. Intensify. Okay, now you'll need some weapons. You have a formidable enemy. The Kotile. Watch it, Yar. He has a lethal drone. And some other tricks up his sleeve. Spiral. Go. Good move, Yar. Now I have a surprise for you. A Zorlon cannon. Use it, Yar. Fire again. Got him. That's revenge. Yar's revenge. A video game. Yeah, this can be fun. This can be a lot of fun. Like asteroids. Get him. Do it. Beautiful. Watch it. Disintegrate. Now let's go into deeper space. Galactic map. Sector 11. Hyperspace. Sights in. Cylon warships, attack. Steady, stand by, photons. Star Raiders. That's it, Star Raiders. That'll keep them on their toes. Let's see what we can come up with next.
We're Atari. We have the vision, and we invented the technology to bring the excitement home to you.
So I looked over this game. It was Star Castle. I played it a bunch. I thought about it on the VCS. I looked it over and I realized, holy crap, this is going to suck. This is going to absolutely suck. And I could not afford to have my first project suck. I did a little preparation, and then I marched myself into Dennis Kobel's office, and I said, look, instead of doing this, I'd like to do this. This is something that I think uses some of the basic game ideas, but I think this is something that would work on the system. This other one won't work. And I just made this little presentation to him. And to his credit, he said, okay, you know what, go for it. The first thing I put up on the screen was an animated character. Most people use a block because they want to start working out their game mechanics and stuff like that. I put up an animation. That was the first thing I put up on a screen. And people would go by and they go, wow, that looks cool. What does it do? I'd be like, nothing. You know, that's what it does. There it is. I said, I'm still working on it. Don't worry. It's like, and then it got to the point where it was time to actually play it and have some of the stuff. So I had achieved my goal of trying to make something interesting. And it sucked as a game, and I was exactly caught in the place I didn't want to be. So what I did was I started taking feedback, which was extremely painful to hear people telling me how much my game sucked. The only thing that really made it tolerable was that I wasn't so self-deluded at that point that I didn't realize it sucked also. Until I worked out making some of the changes and getting it through, I was in very bad shape. And I was feeling some very negative feedback from some other people. And I was feeling, you know, I'm usually the person who's hardest on myself. And that was a tough time for me. And I had to get through that before I could hear what people were saying and start to work on it. And I had to release myself from, but I have to have this, but I have to have this. You know, as a therapist, I always catch people when they say I have to. I always love people say, you know, I have to, but I have to do this. And I always stop and I say, look, you don't have to. Obviously you don't have to because you're not doing it, right? You don't have to, but you could, but there's probably a reason you're not. And the reason I'm able to give that lesson to my clients now is because I had to get over that. I had this have to that was making things not work. And until I could let that go, I couldn't make the game succeed. And when I did, it forced me to think in new ways, to think outside the box, and to go come up with some other left field solution. And when I made those changes, then suddenly yours was really good.
So Adventure was a really popular product, and we were kind of, there was some vibe around maybe a sequel to Adventure. And somewhere in there, I got the idea of doing a series of games that were contests with comic books, with real prizes made by Franklin Mint. We were part of Warner Communications, and somewhere along there, we had started to be doing bits of comic books with the games. And because Warner Communications owned DC Comics. Warner Communications, I happen to know, I don't know that anyone else was paying attention, also owned Franklin Mint, right? Franklin Mint being a collectible company. I don't know, you know, they made plates and little figurines and stuff, I know, and medallions, and not my scene, but you know, it's a creative world. It's hard to talk about this without going me, me, me. I don't love going me, 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 but a lot of it was, I consider myself to basically have been the showrunner of Sword Quest. The concept was mine, the literary concept, the material. So the games are actually moderately literate and erudite, right? The whole story is put together as a lot like a Grail quest or something in Joseph Campbell. It would be a hero's journey, a spiritual evolution, a life. It's a story of a life, of a energetic, a magical life, right, through these mystical systems. So I pulled a lot of, I embedded it in a lot of historical culture of mysticism, and sold the idea, and it went over big. You know, certainly it was brave, it was ambitious, it was audacious, and it had a certain je ne sais quoi, but I don't know what it is. You know, I'll back up a little bit. There was kind of a bizarre effort to do a combination of Twitch and adventure game, to merge and to create an action adventure. I think Howard tried this in Raiders, right, where he tried to make an adventure game that was built into an action game and merge the two. So I consider Howard and I to be some of the pioneers of action adventure. Got to say this in a certain way. So you'd play this action game and maybe get a clue, a prize that you'd add to your inventory. And if you had that in your inventory, then you could unlock, then you'd be on this map. You wouldn't necessarily see the map, but you'd be inside a maze, and a door would open in the maze, and there'd be another action game there. And so it was kind of like a first-person adventure with action elements. That was basically, and you know, I got looking back at it when I say it that way and knowing what was in the times, it was very audacious. And it was actually very creative. It was really, you know, it was really cool.
The 5200 was a tragedy. The 5200 was a good idea gone horribly wrong.
The big problem that we had at Atari, the thing that killed the industry more than any other one thing, even more possibly than the E.T. video game, is that it was the first product life cycle. No one had ever been through a major success video game console life cycle. So where does it end? Nowadays, when somebody comes out with a new system, they already are designing the next system because they know the life of a system. They know a console is good for a certain number of years, and then it's going to die, and it's going to fall off, and that's when we need to be ready and prepared to come in with the new system. Holy crap, you know, our first machine is finally falling off the cliff. We need something. We have something. We can take the 800, 400, 800 computer, repackage as the 5200, spit it out, and we can do it.
So the 5200 was basically what the 400, 800 was going to be 3 years before. It's a tough business. Business is cruel. And you know, like I say, I'll say it again, it was the first time anything was being done. No one knew.
And what happened was the Atari 5200, it grew very large because marketing wanted perceived value, so bigger was better in some respects. And then marketing got really focused on the Intellivision, and Intellivisions had a bunch of buttons. They had a keypad, and they had this disc with 12 distinct regions. And so, hey, if we put an analog stick here, and one that doesn't self-center was the great idea, this will be a better marketing message than the Intellivision controller. And of course, it was a horrible experience. The company lost focus on what was important, and it was gameplay's important. You know, good games sell, bad games don't. If you've got a bad control mechanism, doesn't matter how good the graphics are. It's not going to be fun to play.
Now what do you do? So, and that was the thing. Engineering we really wanted to do something cool, right? We wanted to do like a real next generation because the 400, 800 was already last generation.
The engineering team and the creative team, the game designers, we were so upset, and we all felt that we were making a wrong decision with this controller, that we put together a petition to upper management, and we just explained that, you know, this is a great product, the control is lacking, we've got some other alternatives we want you to see, and my name's number 3 on the list of the petitioners.
See, I wasn't someone who signed petitions so much as talked to people behind the scenes, because I always felt that was more like the way you operate in a corporation. And but I definitely put the word out whenever I could that, like, you know, this is something we either should have done a few years ago, or, you know, can't really do now.
We told marketing, hey, we could make this 2600 compatible. They didn't want anything to do with that. They said they must be very separate and distinct. We can't have backwards compatibility, which at the time we thought might be a great feature. It's a good way to get people that have these Atari games already and keep them on the Atari platform instead of giving them an opportunity to jump to another platform. And so we designed the product specifically so that you could never have 2600 compatibility. About 2 months before launch, they demanded 2600 compatibility. And at that time, we had to build an adapter. And then we actually had to modify consoles that were already made, the first ones, to work with this adapter. And we called this thing the piggyback parasite. We were just horribly embarrassed by that situation. That never should have happened.
There was some big time denial, around Atari, because nobody wants their parade rained on. And when it's the best parade you've ever imagined in your life, nobody wants to see a cloud. You just don't want to see it. So we didn't. When you have a tragedy, and I do believe that the fall of the video game industry in the early 80s was a tragedy. It was a tragedy to many, many people. It changed a lot of lives.
I think it's pretty obvious when it comes to the video game crash that Atari didn't have control over the quality.
I mean, it needed some sort of way to keep just anybody from writing cartridges for it.
And so many people saw this video game gold rush, and they just, started dumping crap. I remember going into KB toy stores and just seeing, really bad box art and just terrible looking games. And that's when I started losing interest, and the market became flooded just with garbage. And it ultimately led to, of course, things like E.T. being, actually buried in the desert like garbage.
And what happened was that E.T. became the face of the crash of the video game industry. And I, of course, was the butt behind the face. That's kind of the way it went.
Greed and hubris, that's what undid Atari. If they just had worked more from a place of like focusing on making great games and delivering great games to the customer instead of like, how can we maximize revenue, I feel like they'd still be a huge powerhouse today.
Frankly, Warner did not understand technology. They didn't understand the consumer marketplace, the video game, and Ray Kassar, I think was afraid of releasing new product because it might not be as successful as VCS. So that's a sure way to fail. And
I regret that we didn't have a new console by '84 that would have made it so that Atari continued to be a really viable business.
We never, ever got down to ever having any process by which we could come up with a better system.
Even to say, I think people do believe that, like, if they just released like the 5200 earlier, or if they released the 7800, or they'd done different things, they would could never have they would have survived the crash a lot better, and they would be like a powerhouse today. Like as a kid, I didn't know much about business, but I just felt like something was wrong.
No one knew anything. Certainly no one knew how to replace an existing console with a new one.
The real one-liner about why the game industry crashed and went away is that it was a first product life cycle and nobody knew what to do.
There's this funny time period in the history of, if I wrote a book on the history of the video game industry, there's this funny time period where we had left Activision and we went from this fabulous AAA office complex, beautiful. We had more space than we needed by a factor of 5, and we went to the most horrible office in Midland Park, New Jersey, in the basement of an optician's office. Game industry, this was after the crash. Game industry was a disaster. And it was just, oh man, what an office. It was horrible. But we survived it. I mean, you gotta do what you gotta do. So anyway, we're in this horrible office, and we're doing C64 stuff at that point. And I get a call from a buddy of mine. Actually, he was our part-time sales guy, and he always visited Toys R Us, and he knew them really well. He called me and said, you know, you're gonna laugh, but they want to know if anybody's doing 2600 games. Because at that point, there were none. Nobody was doing them.
But there were 26 million consoles in homes.
And people were going in Toys R Us saying, why don't you sell games for my Atari anymore? So I said, wow, that's interesting. How many would he buy if he had a 2600 game? He said, oh, you know, 20, 30,000 pieces probably. And I said, all right, I'll get back to you. So we did Title Match Wrestling and Super Skateboarding, first 2 titles. I mean, regular skateboarding, first 2 titles. And he loved them, and they sold like crazy. And at that point in time, we were the only people in the world making games on the Atari 2600. My phone rings, and it's the Tramiels. So he did some 2600 games. You know, do a couple for us, because word got around. There's actually a need. And then Activision calls and says, do some 2600 games for us? And I said, well, why don't you guys just do them? He goes, well, you know, if I could be completely honest with you, we don't have anything. We don't have the specs, we don't have manuals, we don't have the equipment. He said, we couldn't make a 2600 game if we wanted to. So could you make something for us? I tell people that, they're like, who the hell wanted 2600 games? You know what? No one told consumers that there had been a crash. No one went to their house and said, you don't like video games anymore. Because that's what Toys R Us and Walmart said. People don't like video games anymore. But the people at home were sitting going, God damn, I'm tired of combat. Isn't there something else I can play on this machine? So it was good. We had a great run there. We made a lot of money off those games.
How's business?
Booming.
Terrific. How do you keep track of your customers?
My Atari 400 home computer. Excuse me, Dad.
Why Atari?
Shopped around. It's a lot of computing capability for such a low price.
You use it a lot?
Sheriff, life's not all fun and games. There's homework I even program.
Uh-huh.
Atari has lots of software, not all the others do. And of course, only Atari has games like Centipede.
Games?
Well, we executives have to unwind.
Atari home computers. Only Atari puts so much in it for you.
Bought a home computer, huh?
An Atari 800 home computer. Nothing but the best for my son.
Why Atari?
Atari makes computers that, you know, seem friendly, part of the family.
Want to show off?
Sure, they're real easy. Terrific software, huh?
Nice graphics.
And how do you like this for sound capability?
Impressive.
It sure is.
So what's his first project?
Soon, the alphabet. A is for airplane.
Atari home computers. Only Atari puts so much in it for you.
I think the Atari 400, 800 were really the first home computers that I felt like were designed to be in somebody's home and for an average person to utilize.
Atari, you know, made some interesting decisions over the years. I mean, they were #1 in the world in making video games, but they saw home computers were coming, and Apple II was out, and they said, we got to compete with Apple for, you know, computers. So it came down from on high that we were going to make a computer like the Apple II, but better in some way. But the engineering department said, hey, we're video game people. Why are we doing this? But they were told, you will do this. So what actually happened was the engineers made the Atari 800 into the next best video game player. It had all the sprite capability, it had coprocessors in there. You know, the first GPU in a computer was probably in the Atari 800. All of this stuff was going on in the engineering department, and yet the management thought we were making a computer. We were really just making a video game that we could make cool games on.
My participation was mainly on the prototype pre-production side. We had this very sophisticated, allegedly sophisticated, internal interactive test system called the PIT system that we couldn't get a single unit to pass. Labor Day 1979, can you guys work overtime over the weekend? We need to hand build some production units because we need to put them complete through the entire process. They need to be completely finished, consumer product in the box. We need these for JCPenney's so that they can make the holiday catalog. So we worked, I actually didn't leave Atari for about 3 days, hand building these units. And it was like 4 400s and 4 800s to ship on Monday to JCPenney's. They received them at their warehouse, they took pictures of them for the catalog, and then they immediately shipped them back to us. That was it. That's what we needed to do to get this product out.
My main contribution to the Atari 800 operating system, I created a language similar to PostScript that could draw lines and squares and circles and vector graphics drawn into the bitmap of the Atari 800 and put them into the operating system so that I didn't have to put it in any of my games. So I could borrow from the operating system stuff that I'd put in there and use it when making games. So yes, we were tasked with working on the operating system, but we did it our way. We did it in the video game method.
The idea came up that maybe I could get one of these machines for Christmas, and I thought I was going to get an Apple II because that was what I had at school and what I thought was cool. But I got an Atari, and it was an Atari 800 with a tape cassette drive. You know, at first I was like, oh, it's not an Apple, but you know, it's my own computer. It's super exciting. And then the more I got into it, you know, the more I realized it was so much better than the Apple. Probably piss off some Apple people, but it, you know, it was really an amazing machine. I mean, the graphics and sound on it were incredible, and it was a super fun machine to program. And so that was really what got me started.
We had access to the 800, 400, you know, pre-production models for probably a good year before they ever hit the marketplace. And I would literally every weekend check out an Atari 800 and prototype Star Raiders and spend the entire weekend playing Star Raiders. It was just absolutely phenomenal. I couldn't get enough of it.
One of my favorite games in the 800. I really liked Star Raiders. I still play that today. I still bring up my Atari 800 and play that occasionally.
Star Raiders was the killer app. Star Raiders was to the 800 what Halo was to the Xbox. You know, it was the game. You really, pretty much everyone bought it with this system. It was the system seller.
It was very well done. It had a lot of depth. It was easy. It had easy modes where people could get through it, and you could work up to the harder modes, and the harder modes just made things a little more difficult. They didn't penalize you for getting good at the game. So,
what did I do with my 800? And I actually did buy an Atari 800 in the company store, and I paid full price for it, full employee price. And I played Star Raiders because that's what you did on the Atari 800. You know, there was a lot of great stuff about, you know, storing recipes and doing this and learning things, and I did go through some of the learning things, but I played the living daylights out of Star Raiders, which was, I think, probably for a couple of years, the most phenomenal game you could play outside of an arcade.
Atari brings the computer age home.
Okay, Ma, what's the capital of Nebraska? Oh, come on, I'm trying.
Atari home computers can teach you or reach you with important information anytime, day or night.
I already checked the computer. The Bears lost.
How about the Lions?
Oh, you owe me on that, too.
And if your jump shot is a little off, we can help you there, too.
Hey guys, how about a deal? The car tonight for Atari basketball.
No. In fact, there's no end to your possibilities with Atari home computers. They're easy to use and afford. But best of all, they just might be the wisest investment you'll ever make.
Watch this. Hey, Mom. What's the capital of Delaware?
Dover.
I told you she's smart.
Atari home computers. We've brought the computer age home.
These families are learning about home computers. The family with the Atari home computer is learning
Spanish, German,
French,
Italian.
the other.
No foreign languages.
The Atari family is learning
3 programs teach us to program.
the other.
We've only one.
And while the Atari family learns to play Centipede, Star Raiders, and soon,
E.T.
the other learned
We made a mistake.
over 1,000 programs featuring the world's most popular games, but sorry, only with Atari.
There were so many things near the end of my early days with Atari that I wished, like everything we felt was underappreciated. Like I bought a Lynx and I was trying to find people to play the Lynx with me, and everyone else had a Game Boy, and I was like, you guys, Todd's Slime World, let's do this, let's play Warbirds, come on.
And the Lynx was totally Sam's baby. He loved the notion of the hardware, and Sam, man, he loved the Lynx into the ground, right? Against all odds, he wanted to make it successful. You know, we did the original one that was sort of the original design, and then he was like, no, we got to double down on it and do it and make it better.
Being in the Bay Area, you see these ads, come test video games. So I think I tried out at a few places. Electronic Arts comes to mind. Didn't get the job there, but was lucky enough to kind of get the QA job at Atari. Back in the day, I think it was a lot more fun. People playing 4 Lynx games and then having them all go out of sync and then having to track that down. Like, probably at the 1,000th time that happens, it does get a little old. But I think back in the day, you actually got a lot more input into the games. So a lot of the last Lynx games like Lemmings and some of the early Jaguar games like Cybermorph, the QA department actually got a lot of input into those games from a design perspective. You know what? I think the Lynx was great hardware. I like the fact that it was color. And I think the fact that you could have this like 4-way local multiplayer was great.
20 some years later, here I am buying a Lynx with a RGB output because people are still modding them, you know, and selling them on eBay and stuff, right?
I remember sitting in the room with Jack, and Jack saying to all of us, let's go back to our roots. Let's do at least one more game system.
The controller is quirky. The industrial design of both the CD and the main unit are quirky. And the fact that, like, I guess somebody used the tooling on the main unit to make some kind of dental device. Like, it just has like this weird, quirky history that I think is also inviting.
One of the most interesting things about the architecture of Jaguar was this notion of having the Motorola 68000, which basically was responsible for booting and housekeeping, and then the Tom and Jerry chips.
I mean, I think at the time, 68000 was still a strong processor, but obviously it was in the Genesis and other things, so you weren't really getting that true 64-bit experience. But I think there's games out there that took advantage.
There's so many features in Jaguar that for a developer like Jeff Minter that did Tempest 2000 for Jaguar was like, wow, give me this.
I would say other than Cybermorph, it did not necessarily feel like that quantum leap that we were promised. It wasn't the flying cars, as they say, that we would have in the future, but you could see the potential, and that's what was really cool. You could see the parts of Cybermorph, you're like, oh, fully 3D world compared to something like maybe a Star Fox, which was on rails.
My perspective is the rule of thirds, where if you want to wind up with one really, really great game, you need to lay down 9 bets, because out of those 9, 1/3 probably will ship. And out of those 3 games, one is going to be a hit, the other will be and the other probably might be a dinger. There just wasn't enough momentum behind the Jaguar at that time to be able to do that when Sega and Nintendo were basically already on their 3.5 generation of consoles, at those times.
I mean, if Aliens vs. Predator came out as a launch title, maybe the history of the Atari Jaguar might have been slightly different. I think there are a lot more Jaguar fans today than there were when the system actually came out, and it's cool to see people enjoying the system some 20-odd years later. I believe everybody appreciated the innovative aspect, but on the other hand, the software was late, some of it was a little janky, but I think just saying, time heals all wounds, to go onto the Jaguar forums now and look at the love for the system, honestly, like somebody that worked on it, I can't say that I completely understand it, but I totally appreciate it. I'm like, where were you guys like 20 or 30 years ago? Like, you would have made my life like a heck of a lot better.
I feel the best Atari games ever made have been made in the last 5 years. I think the homebrew scene is incredible. People have figured out, and it's unfair to compare because the original people had like 5 weeks to make, ET or whatever. And now people can take, it's like a hobby. You can take as long as you want. And you have access to like special chips and stuff. But still, they're still working. Eventually, making carts that you plug into your original Atari 2600 and they run, and they're super fun.
We saw it evolving, and there was a lot of nostalgia involved for that to happen. We loved this particular game system, and it's a great intellectual challenge.
In 2009, I was given a talk in Philadelphia just talking about the game business and my experience there. And after the talk, somebody came up to me and they said, hey, I just saw this cool book just came out called Racing the Beam. And it's about programming the 2600. And since you mentioned that you worked on 800, I thought you might be interested in this book. And I'm like, it does sound really interesting.
Back in the old days when I had my Atari 800, I did learn 6502 assembly language, and so I've been messing around and making some of my own Atari games. I'm not ready to make Psychonauts on the Atari yet, but someday I'm going to make Psychonauts on the Atari 2600. Not announcing that yet, but don't tell anyone. But.
What is the point of going back to work on one of these old machines anyway? I mean, to me, the point is I want to know what it was like to be, Todd Fryer, and who was, told he has 3 months to write Pac-Man on this terrible machine. And am I a man enough, programmer to be able to do that?
Pac-Man was actually technically quite solid.
It's fun to program for the 2600 because it's unique. It's, 128 bytes, not K, but like bytes of memory. It's so limited that it helps you edit, and so you can't do everything. You can't imagine an experience and then implement it on the Atari. You have to go the other way around. How many blocks can I move on the screen? How can I turn that into a fun game?
It was very, very hard to squeeze a 128 level game with a title screen and a boss encounter and all that into 4K of ROM, because that's one of the limitations on the 2600 if you're going to live within the original constraints. And so I learned a ton about the 2600 along the way. I had a lot of fun. It was a lot of hard work, and I'm proud of the way it turned out.
I think of the homebrew as the hobbyist who wants to see if he can do it, and he makes a game and he makes a few for friends. That has evolved into some actual publishers making Atari 2600 games that are out there.
But there was a guy came on there the other day, and he's like, I just want to say this is the most supportive technical community I have ever been part of. So it is an amazing community and very welcoming to new people. So I would encourage people to do that.
There was no console war in the beginning. There was, in the beginning there was only Atari, and the children looked upon it and saw that it was good and bought Atari, and then asked for Atari games for every Christmas and birthday. The Easter eggs, finding the Easter eggs in Howard's game and Warren's game, those were huge moments for me in my childhood, and my favorite early gaming experiences, especially finding that room in Adventure. That path that everybody, whoever found the Easter egg, follows those clues, and then discovers this, this secret room, this message hidden by the creator of the game, who I didn't even know who he was. And here's his name, and a whole secret room, that most kids who play this game never found. I found this secret place left by the creator, with a message for me. It was profound, and the first time that it ever happened in a video game. And so years later, when I was, I think had the initial idea for Ready Player One, was what if Willy Wonka had been a video game designer? And what if he held his golden ticket contest inside a video game? And that immediately made me think of this secret room at Adventure, and how that could be, how he finds his worthy successor, instead of a tour through the factory where he slowly kills off all the children. It could be an Easter egg hunt inside this, sprawling video game, and it could be hidden the way that those Easter eggs were hidden in the Atari games. And so there's no way I ever would have written Ready Player One if I hadn't grown up with an Atari and playing those games and finding those Easter eggs.
As I was reading through it, there was just so much familiarity in there. It felt like, as I was reading it, that the person who had written it, that I grew up with them. Because some of the names that were in there, some of the locations, some of the references were things that I thought only I knew, and nobody else in the world would understand or appreciate any of it. My literal opening, my email to him, before anything blew up on Ready Player One, my literal opening was just like, we have to know each other, because there's things in this book that only I know. Where did we meet before? That was the beginning of our full communication, which led to the stacks.
He read Ready Player One, and it spoke to him, and he sent me an email that said, hey, I make video games for a living, and your book really spoke to me, and if you ever want to make a video game, let me know. And I was right in the middle of trying to figure out if I could somehow do a promotional contest for the paperback that mirrored the contest in the novel. I wanted to do some sort of contest with 3 video game challenges and a grand prize at the end of it. And because Mike made that offer, I took him up on it. I'm like, oh, well, we could make an Atari game that you have to beat as the first challenge, and it could be the game that Wade makes in the novel.
Part of what made the book feel like it was written for me is because of the context around the 2600 rite of passage in there. Because for programmers in the game industry, 2600 is this really difficult platform to develop games for. To get anything to even appear on screen, to get anything to even work correctly, you have to just break your brain and rid it of everything that you understand about how games are developed today and go back to this kind of like primitive, primordial way of coding. And so for a lot of programmers, it is a rite of passage. If you can do that, you can do anything.
Wade makes his own game, and it's the Stacks. It's based on his life in the Stacks, and he describes it as a Pitfall ripoff that has you climbing around the stacked trailers, looking for food voucher power-ups and trying to avoid like pedophiles. And it's like a one-paragraph description of this game. But I sent it to Mike, and he's like, "Oh, hell yeah!"
And so I had dabbled over the years with trying to understand 2600 programming. I'd made a couple small games, a couple hacks. So when this kind of came around, it was the perfect excuse to just finally deliver something that was all original and build something from the ground up. Once it started to work, it was completely satisfying. I felt like I had mastered what the greatest engineers in the world have mastered before me, and that I finally had an understanding of it. And to get there, of course, I had to enlist some help. And so that help came in the form of Kevin Wilson, our CTO at Digital Eclipse. I didn't mention this before, but we only had a few weeks to pull this off. So we were not only trying to learn 2600, but we're also given the time frame that basically ET had to try to get this game out the door. So we were reliving the worst of Atari's development history all over again, and I savored every second of it.
In our original contest version, all the items are hidden in the same place, which is great because we had people making maps. For like the first time since they were kids, they were making maps of the stacks to remember, so if they died, they could go back and find where the items were. But then they added randomization, and now it might be one of the best Atari games ever made. Not to brag, but the stacks is pretty deep and pretty replayable for an Atari game. That's why I think Atari is always going to hold a special place in the hearts of people like me, just because it was, it was the first, and it was, so needed. We were so bored in the late 70s. We needed video games at home so badly. The fact that other better consoles came later is because they saw the giant cultural and economic behemoth that Atari immediately became. Atari created the video game industry, the home video game industry, and everybody that's come since then is, kind of building on what Atari created.
When we started, video games were almost considered to be a bastardization of this wonderful technology. Why are you using it for fun when you could be creating missiles? I think we stood for innovation, and also we were the genesis story of the video game, which is kind of important. So I think you always have a hallowed position when you're the first.
Yeah.
When we chose the Fuji logo, I wanted it to be an upward swoosh. And I think that if you look at the Atari logo, it's a collective, it's aspirational, just in the nature of the graphic. Also, Atari, I lifted it from the Game Go. So it's a game word. But I hadn't realized that it also means bullseye.
Right.
It also means jackpot. So, it's got this affirmative. In fact, I was talking to a Japanese guy one time, and he says, "Very good name, Atari. Perhaps a bit boastful for Japanese."
You're like, spot on for Americans.
Spot on for Americans.
Yeah.
One of the ethos of Atari was work hard, play hard. So we always had games, not just Atari games, but foosball and pool tables in the snack rooms and what have you. What that said was, we don't care when you come to work. If you come to work, get your job done, we're okay. We're all adults here. And we don't care how you come to work. You want to wear tennis shorts and blue jeans? Do you want to wear a tuxedo? We don't care. We had one guy that liked to wear ball gowns, but that's another story. I could tell some stories, though, about how I used to mess with the people who copied me.
Oh, please. Oh, I'd love to hear that.
Okay. Atari started by building games that you could do in a garage shop.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so anybody that had a garage shop could copy us. And so of the 150,000 estimated Pong-type games that were created, Atari only shipped 30,000 of them. So we got less than a fifth of our market.
Right.
You know, and so as we innovated, people would start copying us. And I thought, I'm going to get them. So I had our semiconductor suppliers. We were a kind of a big deal in the semiconductor industry because they were selling a lot to the military and that sort of thing, but they'd sell 20 or 100 chips. We were buying thousands.
Right.
And so I had them mismark the chips. So that we had...
That you guys were using.
That we were using.
So if somebody tried to reverse engineer it.
So
wow.
if they reversed engineer and just bought off the shelf those same numbers, they'd populate the board and they wouldn't work.
Did you ever hear of anybody doing that?
Oh yeah. We in fact,
That's brilliant.
We had one company that basically declared bankruptcy because they had a whole floor full of machines that they worked because they were hurrying to do it.
Oh man.
And we had the temerity to have a champagne party on their front lawn. We celebrated their demise and invited them, of course.
Did they show up?
No.
What do you think Atari's role is, not just in video games, but in popular culture today?
Well, I think that Atari has an unassailable role as being the Genesis story. I believe that it is understood by a lot that it succeeded because of creativity. 30 of those years, it was kind of in hands that were not kind to it. Don't say anything bad. So I think that pieces of the brand were damaged. Not irrevocably, but it could have been husbanded better. And so right now, I think that it would be good to take the innovation legacy and push it forward into the future.
Breakout was really early. It's a ball and paddle game, right? And it was really an idea for Nolan to do that. I mean, he had a lot of ideas, and he was the guy that went around me and corralled Jobs into designing this, not knowing that Jobs wasn't an engineer and couldn't do that. And Jobs wasn't about to tell him, but his buddy was, who was just the sweetest, brightest savant. And I come in that was not under development. It was like, what? And Jobs says, yeah, he doesn't know that. And I found out later that because Woz was coming in at night, he's working at HP, and he liked HP, but Atari was a lot more fun. So I go in and there's a finished game. And I'm going, what the this is crazy. You heard the story. I'll tell you my version because I've seen some different numbers, but as I understand it, Nolan said he would give Jobs a bonus of $1,000 a chip for every chip less than 50 that he was able to do this with. Now, knowing that this had more objects and stuff than Pong did, and Pong was 76 chips, it's a pretty safe bet that Nolan's not going to have to pay a penny for this, right? Again, Woz is one of the most gifted, brilliant men engineering. Woz designs it with like 24 chips. Now, Nolan didn't say you had to be able to buy the chips. So some of the chips were chips out of Hewlett-Packard that you couldn't get. But there was the prototype of the working game. And you look at a schematic and I couldn't understand how would this thing work.
Vectors are amazing things, right? Like the fact that vector graphics were phenomenal and they continue to hold up really well. So I think when we look at Tempest or Tempest 2000 or Tempest 4000, I feel like those games of all of the games, those old games have aged the best. Not Tempest specifically, but the vector-based games, and Tempest just being a really incredibly strong example of a vector-based game because it still looks beautiful.
Aesthetically, I just think Tempest is a timeless game. Asteroids is a timeless game.
The old CRTs, the cathode ray tubes, had a beam that would go across the screen very fast, and it would draw the line. So you drew that always. So that was always being drawn, and you could turn on and off the beam, or beams if it's color, red, green, blue in color, and create an image. Vector doesn't do that. Vector, you actually draw the lines. So there is no raster going on. The beam isn't doing this down the screen. If you want to draw a red line that goes like that, you put the beam there and you push it across the screen to there. So you are actually doing an Etch-a-Sketch is the best way to think about it.
One of the interesting limitations and why it's so good for space games on Vector is if you don't draw something, the screen is black. It's not kind of sort of gray, it's black.
If the hardware stopped in a coin-op game, the last picture would stay there. If the hardware stops in a vector generator, it goes black. Because you have to draw it. You're drawing the beams. There's no raster. There's nothing automatic in that. And I like that as well. That meant I could draw something and I didn't have to worry about it again. If I wanted to move it, I just redrew it over here. Before, you have to erase it from that space and rewrite it over here. Nah, didn't like that. Too much work.
The limitation isn't how many dots you have, it's how many inches of light you have. And a lot of people really love that white on black look.
You could get these really fine details for the time. I mean, if you go back and look at it now, it's not as high res as you think it is, but the ships and the shots and the way it looked, and you could adjust the brightness on an individual item, you know, that bright shot in Asteroids, for example, and that goes across the screen. There's nothing like that. It's just an amazing look, and I wanted to work on it.
We started with black and white. I worked a little bit on Battlezone when I worked on the simulator, which was after Battlezone came out, but if you remember Battlezone, it was green. Those weren't green lines, that was a green template that was over the top that made it green.
I got color when I did Space Duel, which I took over from another programmer who, for some reason, just kind of lost it and left the company and kind of evolved it from what he had started. I wanted more time to work on it, and another programmer was working on Asteroids Deluxe, and I was doing color asteroids. That's what I was doing with it. That's what Space Duel originally started as color asteroids. And they said, oh, you know, we're not going to do that because Asteroids Deluxe just came out. So they gave the hardware and some of the code I did to Dave Toyer, and he did Tempest. And then some of that came back, and I did Space Duel. So you'll see things that are similar that cross through it.
So Vector Sector was born out of the idea of what if all of Atari's vector games existed in the same universe? And we went from there. It was great to talk to Owen Rubin, who created Major Havoc, Space Duel. And when he played Vector Sector, he got through the asteroids phase and he got to Lunar Lander, and he was like, oh, you should do this with linked ships. And he didn't know that we'd done that. So that was like a thrill. Also, when we got to the end of the game, we played a linked dual multiplayer game. We got to the end and he was having a conversation with me. He glanced up and he saw that we had his initials in the high scores as a default high score. And he just threw out a, "Oh, thanks." Yeah, thought that was cool.
Well, at the beginning, it was sort of forbidden to consort with the enemy.
First off, we had a vibrant coin-op business that was making money and keeping us in business, and consumer wasn't making anything. I didn't want to screw with that. I did not want to damage that.
There was a door that said, "Don't even think about entering here." And I was like, I work for this company. I opened the door and walked in, and Al turned around and goes, "What are you doing in here? Who the hell are you? Why are you here?" And so I said, "Well, I work for this company. What are you guys doing?"
Oh, and found out how to open the door between the two places. And what's this? And I'm going, "What the hell are you doing?" Anyway, we became friends.
I was one of the few people in CoinOp that spent a lot of time in the consumer group, sort of going back and forth.
I believe that Al Alcorn was sincerely concerned that CoinOp would be a distraction on his group, which we're doing a very ambitious project on a very tight schedule.
Other companies like Bally all of a sudden took some of their engineers in CoinOp, and first off, I didn't think these were the right kind of engineers to do consumer. It's a different cost accounting, a different culture. Number two, I didn't want to screw with CoinOp's success.
The arcade games were pretty much in one area, and the consumer people were in another area.
Engineering was upstairs for consumer products. We were downstairs, and I only knew a few of them, and it was because we water skied together.
There really was two separate companies, it felt like, at a time. They had very different development environment. There was no synergy between the two, really, other than that we shared games.
I have been known to joke that the point of CoinOp games is primarily selling players their own adrenaline. So you want an intense, fast-pitch game, and you'll blame yourself if it's over in 3 minutes, not the game. A person who pays 20, 30, 40, 50 bucks for a cartridge wants to milk that thing. So the games themselves are different.
Every machine is state of the art. It's all new, fresh, challenging stuff, and it's exciting, and it's real design.
CoinOp gets to use more expensive hardware. They get to use tons and tons of hardware, and they get to refresh their hardware all the time, right? So what's happening is the Atari 2600 chip, the 6502, is a chip you could make in '76. Now Moore's Law is cruising along, doubling computer power every 3 years. But we're using a chip from '76.
Every couple of years, a new console would come out. And Atari just had to live with the old technology, but fortunately with programmers figuring out new ways to use it.
But for me, there was no rivalry. It was, they made games and they were interesting ideas, and a lot of them we were going to have to try and copy.
What happened, though, was as the VCS really started to make distribution, and really started to get out there, and some games really started to catch on, it became apparent that the profit potential from the home games was actually much higher than it was in CoinOp. So I'll tell you another pecking order sign that goes on, which raises a lot of interesting things, both financially and emotionally, is the idea of royalties. Because one of the big difference between VCS and CoinOp was CoinOp people got royalties. They got some kind of bonus participation in the success of their games, which VCS people didn't. That got to be a sore point, not between CoinOp and engineering, but between VCS and management. And it's like, why aren't we doing that?
Atari had a bonus plan that was based on how your game sold. And then the consumer group wanted their own bonus plan based on how their game sold. So they would take a game designed by the CoinOp that was in the arcade, they'd make a 2600 cartridge out of it, it would do really well, they get big bonuses, and we weren't included at all. So there was this kind of like, wait a minute, why are they taking our ideas and we're not included? That was resolved later.
Everybody, you know, identifies as the hero of their own narrative. You know, when you start checking the narratives against each other, that's when you find some interesting differences. And it wasn't, I never felt that coin-op people lorded over us, and I don't think we felt like second-class citizens, but it was well known that coin-op was working on hotter technology, doing cooler stuff, and we were trying to keep up with a technology that was falling farther and farther and farther behind. That's just the reality of it.
They both needed each other, and that's the way most of us looked at it. It was a collaboration, not a competition.
My name is Evelyn Cito. I was a graphic designer at Atari, both in the coin-operated division and the consumer division. I majored in graphic design while I was in college, and when I finished, I went back to LA and helped in my family's business, which was a restaurant business. And when I returned, a friend of mine was working at Opera in Harrington, and she was moving on to another position. And so she had me interview with George Opperman, and I was able to come on board on his staff as a production artist. During that time, which is when I started with George, it was the early 70s, and Silicon Valley was just barely a term that was barely coming up. Nolan Bushnell had his company Syzygy, a gaming company, and he needed to change the name of the company. George Farraco, one of his colleagues, suggested that he speak to George Opperman. So I remember them coming in, and George he took on the assignment of redesigning the logo for Syzygy. And they gave him the name Atari. And so, you know, I remember George doodling on his desk. Yeah, he was just doing little doodles, and, you know, from there, you know, he maybe selected a few of them to show Nolan. And they, you know, they picked the one that they did, which is the one with the Fuji and the Atari. And back then, everything was done by hand. There was no computers. Everything was, you had to ink, and you had to spec type and order type, and then paste it all up on a board. So yeah, everything was kind of handcrafted back then. And so, yeah, that was my first position, was with George doing production art. And so once they decided on which one they were going to do, I got the assignment of ordering the type and inking the Fuji. So that was my first jobs in working with Atari, was to ink that Fuji. Nolan liked names that started with A's because they were at the front of the alphabet. And because also at the time Pong was our main product, the main product. Now George says he liked the idea of it sweeping because the Pong blip would sweep, right? So that's George's. There are people who attribute that to George. George Farraco doesn't believe that was true. But so I honestly don't know where it came from, because obviously he didn't tell me. He just said, "Here, ink this up." So part of it is probably an A, and part of it is the sweep. It's probably all of that could be true. So whatever it was, it's definitely stood the test of time. And he picked the hairy type font for the Atari, and I think that's actually stood the test of time as well. Shortly after that, I left George, so that was like in '71, and I left in '72, and so George probably continued working with Atari at the time. I had moved on to another company, and in 1976, George called me and asked me, told me he was giving up his company, and he was going to go inside at Atari and become their full-time art director. And he needed an assistant, and asked me if I would be interested in doing that. I kind of thought of it as a placeholder, actually. I wasn't sure how long I would do this, and not being that familiar with the company. But anyway, I said, okay, you know. So we were in this little cubby hole Our two desks were facing each other, and basically we had a drawing board each, and George was doing all the graphics and all the advertising and whatever that was required. George himself was an illustrator as well as a designer, as well as a marketing guy, as well as a copywriter. So he would write all the copy, and he would write all the promotional materials for Atari. So he was an in-house advertising agency. Because I wasn't an illustrator, so the things that didn't require illustration, I would work on some of those, or I would collaborate with one of the illustrators. I might come up with a concept, and then one of the illustrators would design the graphic for me, like in Superbug or in Golf. Bob Flamani was the artist on those particular pieces, and so, but the concept of how it looked, the general concept might be mine, but then I would basically have the illustrator do it, which is not unusual because a lot of graphic designers are not illustrators. I worked on Superbug, I worked on Fire Truck, which was a two-man game. And see, because those graphics I could deal with, they weren't, it didn't require me to illustrate a person or an animal, so I could do graphic things, but I wasn't able to do illustrations. And I did do football, and or the soccer game that was created from that. And then when Atari got into pinball, I worked on a concept for the Wonder Woman pinball game. And that didn't require me to be such an conceptual illustrator, because I already had reference material to work with in terms of the comic series. And so eventually we grew to a staff of about eight people. And we had a production artist, but George was still doing all the advertising and the brochures and all the marketing materials for any of the games that came up. And so eventually the company grew, and I stayed there for a couple of years, and ultimately decided that I had an opportunity to go. In 1977, Atari was already working on the consumer video game system. And I had heard about it, but didn't know a whole lot about it. I got asked if I would like to join the consumer group. And so I went ahead and did that. And that's where I felt at home, because then I can focus on graphic design more than illustration. That was a great opportunity for me to really focus on branding. They were starting to introduce some other game systems. And so they wanted to figure out how to market it. And we wanted to take a look at what kind of packaging design do we want to go with, because at the time the VCS system was a black background with little vignettes of game players and parents and screen grabs of some of the video games. And so we decided to take a look at what we could do with it. The video computer system was sort of a generic name, and so we decided to maybe focus on blowing up the name Atari. So we made some mock-ups to do that. Basically, on a product shelf, you got 3 seconds to grab somebody's attention. We banded the box with Atari with the number of the game system, and we created some packaging and took it to a store to see how it would stand up next to the competition. And at the time, Odyssey was out, Magnavox, Coleco, there were other game systems out there, and they were similar in design to what we had already created. So we took it to a store and took some photographs, and with the other competition in the background, it was clear that the Atari, branding big was the way to go. Yeah, it's like, hello, why didn't we think of that sooner? But obviously somebody didn't think of it before we did. And then at the same time, I think Star Wars came out, and so we thought, well, gee, the space age was coming about. And so maybe we should look at, maybe color isn't the way to go. So they wanted to see what else we could do to make it look more space agey. So we came up with the silver concept of the packaging, and ultimately that's the way we went. At the time, our cartridge boxes were all real colorful and rainbow. The rainbow stripes seemed to be sophisticated enough and give it some color. And so from that, I thought, it went underneath the silver band on all the boxes, so it seemed to work for that. And I think that was sort of a nod to the fact that, okay, we still have, the rainbow was sort of a nod to all the color boxes. The Fuji's always stayed there, and I think the typefaces always stay there. Although some people have played around with the typeface a little bit, but you know, you can't change it. It looks, it's a classic.
The main theme of Berserk, as I understand it, and as I've always understood it, is basically you're one of the last humans trying to escape this prison inhabited by robots. Because there's this character in the game called Evil Otto, and he bounces at you with this smiley face, but it's so sinister because all he's really trying to do is just pulverize you to like nothing. And he comes at you so aggressively. Even back in the day, the story got around really fast that somebody died playing Berserk.
The rumblings of rumors when it got out, like, oh my gosh, someone died while playing Berserk. They must have, I don't know if the game shot back at them, I don't know what happened.
And I think that added to the mystique of the game, because could this game kill you? But in reality, as far as I understand, it was somebody who actually had a heart condition who happened to be playing Berserk when an episode occurred, but that of course got embellished to this game will kill you.
I remember Berserk coming out for the 2600 and I was very impressed. The characters were very simple, but moved exactly like the arcade. The gameplay was great. I thought it was one of the great Atari cartridges, up there with Space Invaders in that time frame of arcade ports.
One of my favorite games on the 2600 happened to be Berserk. I thought it was really well produced. It didn't look like other Atari games where they flickered a lot. The characters were really solid, everything looked great, and it was a really great representation of the arcade game.
Yeah, the gameplay was well tweaked, which is not given the credibility that it should. The amount of tweaking that gameplay requires to make an excellent game, to make a truly great game, it's unappreciated.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
When I was learning, or basically teaching myself how to program the Atari 2600, as one does, I started to dabble with audio, and I had seen somebody had replicated synthesized voice on the 2600. And so that kind of occurred to me that it would be really cool to take that approach and that concept and apply it to Berserk to have the perfect version of Berserk for the Atari 2600. That set in motion my desire to just like pursue relentlessly putting voice into 2600 Berserk. And then my understanding of the arcade game is there's a specific speech synthesis chip that was used for the game. And to compare that to the 2600, there's no such thing on the 2600. And so in order to get speech to even sound similar to that chip, you have to apply all of Atari 2600's resources to it. So in order to get the sample to play back fast enough, you have to do things like don't display the screen. So the screen goes black so you can get a cleaner and more audible sound out of the processor, the sound processor. Some of the changes that I had applied to the game early on were mostly palette related and some graphical changes. Also added a title screen. I always felt that like later Atari 2600 games that had title screens were really cool, so I wanted us to feel like those. But ultimately that was where my work ended. But then the community hopped in after that release, and Dennis DeBro particularly found out by disassembling the game that there was actually code for the robots to shoot diagonally like in the arcade game. I found it fascinating that after I dabbled a little bit with Berserk to watch other people go in and find all these other things within the source code that I missed completely, and started to apply that to like what would become ultimately Berserk Voice Enhanced.
So I started collecting on the 2600 when I was working at Looking Glass in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with Rex Bradford, who had actually worked for Activision and Parker Brothers back in the day. And that inspired me. It's like, I should go pick up a 2600 and then start buying all those games I could never afford as a kid.
So I started looking on eBay to regain my old 2600 library, whatever. And in my searching, I found the Stella List. The Stella List was a collection of programmers that were interested in programming the VCS.
I think everybody who got into homebrew pretty early in the 2600 was a member of the Stella List, and that's where everybody shared their findings on the 2600. And of course, the original developer documentation that was at Atari was scanned and provided through the list. A lot of source code for demos, like audio demos, sprite demos, playfield demos, and all stuff, kind of passed through the Stella mailing list.
That was where all the activity was for development for a long time before forums really came along.
Ever I needed help or if I had a problem, the team on the Stella List were there to help me get past my problems.
And it was almost all this technical discussion on how to develop for the Atari 2600, picking apart the machine and learning, the internals, because the 2600 is a very arcane machine and difficult to develop for.
It feels like it took me a year just to understand how to get playfield graphics on the screen.
And there's always new people coming into the hobby wanting to learn how to program. So yeah, it's been amazing to watch, and there's just so much development, hardware and software, on all these platforms on Atari Age.
In my mind, 2600 programming is as raw as it gets. It kind of shows people all your flaws. And so I'm really nervous about sharing things on the Atari Age forums. I have in the past, and I've received some great feedback, but ultimately at the end of the day, for me, I feel so inadequate when I post things there, because there's so many smart people who are way smarter than me, doing just incredible things, and I always feel like what I'm posting is just like a friend of mine used to say, it feels baby school.
But on the Atari Age forum, they have a 2600 programmer forum that you can go to. Yeah, anyone is willing to just jump in and help you.
There's a number of really talented programmers still doing wonders on the 2600.
That part of the Stella List lives on the Atari Age forum. Absolutely.
When we started Atari Age, back in 2000, we were working on 2000, opened it in 2001. Atari really wasn't paying attention to this growing community of people who are basically celebrating the brand.
I don't think there was any time during those years when homebrew really started to take off for the Atari consoles that Atari at that time felt in any way threatened.
I don't think they knew we existed. and I don't think they cared. I just don't think they cared.
I think most of the time they just kind of ignored it.
But Adventure 2, when it started out, was not endorsed by Atari in any way. And when they got wind of it, it came very close to shutting the project down. But they were able to work together, and now it is an IP that is approved by Atari. And now the community, they can play it. I mean, it was a great piece of work.
At some point, I realized, well, Atari Age, costs money to run. It's running on like a dedicated server with the forum and the games database. We can, instead of having ads on the website, we can just start publishing games ourselves. So it just went really slowly first. And one of the first games was Mike Micah's Berserk voice enhanced.
And ultimately, it was the information I gathered from shared resources in the homebrew community that led me to adapt Berserk's voice.
And from there, it just kind of blossomed, and a small group of home developers, including Thomas Jentz, allowed me to start publishing their games in the Atari Age store.
Kurt Bendel was working with Atari and did the first flashback. It wasn't exactly what he envisioned, but it was the starting point, and that was his whole plan, as I understand it. It's like, let me get in the door with this, and then I can produce what I wanted. That was the flashback too. In doing that and contracting with Atari, Kurt reached out to homebrew developers because he wanted to showcase, hey, not only do you have these classics here, but you have people that are still programming for this unit, and he wanted to show that. I was one of the homebrew developers that he reached out to. I'm honored that he reached out to me on that.
I had the fortune of knowing Kurt Vendel years and years ago. I met him at this trade show. Well, it was like a fan show called World of Atari, and it was in '98, I believe. And it was pretty clear he knew a lot about Atari. And not only that, he had a lot of ephemera from the old Atari days. And so we became fast friends. And a lot of the early Digital Eclipse projects that we worked on, Kurt helped us out, and he found the information we needed. He helped us figure out how things worked. He was an incredible hardware guy, incredible software guy, and he was so hell-bent on getting the story right. And so I give a lot of credit to Kurt for paving the way, for giving people the understanding of like where the real heroes were in those old days at Atari.
A lot of games were in development at Atari when the market crashed in '94, and a lot of them were done or very close to being done, and not just for the 2600, but also the 5200. A lot of these prototypes are being discovered during this time period, and there were various people who were creating packaging for them that would be reminiscent of, hey, what if Atari published it? What if Fox published this game? What would it look like? And you'd have a line of people at the Classic Gaming Expo on Saturday or Sunday to get their copy of the game, and they would sell out back then. And, they're $50, $60 a piece, but, they look great. They look like this is what real sports basketball we never released, but, there's a really nice community-produced reproduction of it. They come from all over. Sometimes they come from the original developers who were working at Atari, took copies of those with them, thankfully, before they were thrown out. And they were nice enough to they either sell them or loan them out so people can actually dump them and then, preserve them indefinitely. And then Atari sent out a lot of lab loaner carts, basically like cartridges of games that were going to be released, like sending them to magazines in advance. Especially magazines back then had a really long lead time of months. So you'd want to get those games to the magazines so they could test them and then have an article ready, by the time the game comes out. So that's where a lot of the cartridges come from. They had a unique lab loaner label, returned to somebody at Atari with a name handwritten on the label. I'm sure you've seen them. Even now, there's still prototypes being unearthed, which is just remarkable that so long, after all this time has passed, we're still finding new games that either we never knew about or knew about and just didn't think existed. But people are finding them still. When you think of the 80s and video games, Atari is the company that comes to mind. And because those people grew up with, there's a lot of nostalgia today still for the brand. And I think that's the main reason why you see people so passionate about Atari.
When we do our best, video games are an art form. What we're doing doesn't just distract people or pass the time. We leave them with something.
The brand was so iconic for so long that it feels like it was a part of their life, and that it felt like a part of their identity. So I think whenever Atari over the years has done something against those core values of what people have brought to Atari and how they feel they fit with Atari, that's why you'd see a lot of vocal retaliation to what Atari was doing, because it was so personal to them.
And Atari did a great job with marketing. They had a lot of the arcade hits, like Pac-Man and Defender, and just tons of arcade games that people wanted to play at home. And they just did a great job with marketing, getting the systems out there, and that's what people remember from those early days.
For me, it is the excitement that I had as a young teenager having the VCS. That excitement is still there for me. And you've heard this before, you never forget your first love. That would be the VCS for me.
I think video games are proving to be more and more like the music business. Whatever you heard at certain points in your life of music, that's the soundtrack for your life. And when you hear those songs, when you were a kid or when you were a teen or when you were in college, it brings back those memories, and you're attached to that time and to that version of yourself, and the music takes you back there.
I think for a lot of people, it was the very first system that they had, especially for the 2600. And even then, the Pong systems that came before that, and Atari was active in arcades as well. I think the combination of the home consoles, arcades, and then computers, that kind of trifecta really kept Atari in everyone's minds. Versus the other companies only had like a console, home console, and didn't do the other things.
I took my 8-bit 800 XL with me to college, and that's what I wrote my reports on. Now, granted, everybody in the dorm down the hall heard it pecking on the the 1027, but hey, I did my reports on it.
There were people who dedicated their lives to just making sure that an Atari 800 could stay working, and they would sell parts as cheap as they could to people to keep their machines working. And so for, I'd say, like 3 decades, basically, you've had all these kind of like unknown people working behind the scenes just to keep Atari alive.
Millions of people grew up with these consoles. They enjoyed them. Their first interaction with video games for a lot of people, and computers. And and Atari made a ton of great arcade games as well that are very memorable. So again, I think all of that just helped to keep the brand alive, even when Atari wasn't very active.
Ultimately, I think Atari, the name, was what survived, but not Atari, the game company. It was a different game company. It was really just Atari by name. And so we were left with a huge community of people who grew up with the Atari. It was a very personal thing for them that felt like they were being abandoned by the namesake in some ways. And so they were the ones who were the torchbearers. These are people who kept Atari alive.
I was in Europe, in Germany, and I was waiting for some friends, and all of a sudden this person comes walking by in a bright green, Kelly green shirt with a white Atari across it. And then later on, I was at the Gap store at Christmas time, and I saw a multicolored Atari T-shirt for children, and I said, well, I kind of chuckled to myself, and I said, Jesus, Atari is just not going to go away. And then, of course, I had to buy the shirt for my great nephew. So.
After the success of the Atari VCS, Mattel, as a toy company, looked at this and said, maybe we should consider getting into this business.
They started their Mattel Electronics division, releasing handheld games. Their handheld football, which was an LED game, was a smash hit.
Somebody had the idea that the TI, Texas Instruments calculator chip, could also be used for games. It worked in calculators, we could make a game out of it. That's where those handheld games came from.
When I first saw it, I'm like, how is this football? Because the field is only this big. How is this 100 yards? And then, of course, you play it and you realize you have to go multiple times to get a touchdown. But oh man, it was great.
The Atari VCS was being sold in toy stores. Mattel did not like giving up shelf space and consumer dollars in toy stores. And I think as much as anything, it's that sense of holding your position, holding market share in the toy industry. That plus the sense that there was a potential here, I think, is what drove the decision.
Mattel saw that Atari was making lots of money, hand over fist, making video games, and decided to make their own console, which they called the Intellivision.
They had an outside consulting group make a set of initial games for the machine for the playtest.
They contracted with a company run by a man named Glenn Hightower to develop the system and develop cartridges for it. So he ran this company, APH Technology Consultants. Mattel found him and contracted him and his company to produce the system and the games. And in 1979, the end of 1979, they test marketed the Intellivision, and then it went full release in 1980.
They test marketed the Intellivision video game console in Fresno, California, and it tested out great. And this was late 1980, and that was when the radio ad got put on the radio. I was actually driving home from work one day, and I heard an ad on the radio, and the ad said, "Do you want to work in the exciting world of video games?" And I didn't know whether to look down at the radio or look up to God that I was being talked to it this way. And would you like to help shape the future of this exciting new entertainment medium? At first, they did not believe that I had been programming video games for 9 years. Eventually they realized I was telling the truth, and I got hired as one of the original 5 in-house programmers at Mattel. So the original 5 team members at Intellivision on day one were Gabriel Baum, who was our manager, Mike Minkoff, John Soule, myself, Rick Levine. The consultants at APH who had been working on the test market games also continued to stay involved, and they also were working on games in parallel to us. But like modern video game companies, Mattel realized they wanted to control the development themselves, and that's why they built an in-house team. If you were a toy designer or you worked for the toy company, you turned left and you went into what was then a modern office tower. If you turned right, you went down into where we were, except that was a converted warehouse.
The entire video game division, we were in a separate building. And at lunchtime, we were allowed to walk down this middle corridor to the lunchroom, and everybody's doors in the toy company, all the doors were closed. And it was like, you're not allowed to go into any of those doors. It was very like, secret, secret, secret. And then we would go and we'd have lunch, and then we'd go back. And one day we're walking down that corridor, and some like little like motorized car was zooming around. It was like, oh, there's life, there's a toy, but it went through a door and it closed. And so we were outsiders.
Atari developed this joystick, which is just a stick coming up, and you can move it with the Atari in 8 different directions: forward, backward, left, right, and then the 4 diagonals. And that controlled the object on the screen. Mattel decided to go better than that. Mattel controller is a rectangle with this disc on the bottom, a round disc, but 12 buttons over it. Anyway, what the disc was, you can press it in any of 16 directions, and that controlled what goes on the screen. If you're used to a joystick, it's difficult to work with.
I didn't like the controller. I didn't like the controller. I didn't like it.
I mean, a joystick with a button, that feels like a video game. This other one felt like an accounting package.
The Intellivision had the bad interface versus the joystick. Things like that were just things you would argue over all the time.
It felt maybe even like the games were very soft. They weren't edgy.
I'd say visually the Intellivision looked a lot better, but also the 2600, because of its requirement for drawing the screen, meant that every game had to run at 60 frames per second.
Like even today we had discussions like, can we get to 60 frames a second? And like every Atari game that exists is 60 frames a second, because if they didn't, they have to hit that or the screen won't draw, you know? So no Atari game has any sort of lag or anything, because they had no option to have lag.
How many 2600 games were made? 600 in the original few years of the console? That was possible because the software controlled everything, and in the Intellivision, the hardware did what it could do and nothing else.
Out of all the systems I've worked on, the one actually that kind of bested me was the Intellivision, because it's such a unique architecture.
The instruction set for the Intellivision was not an 8-bit instruction set. General Instruments made it 10 bits wide. So when we wrote instructions, we had more opportunities, more things we could do in assembly language because it was 10 bits wide. Basically, it just means we had a book with more pages listing the dictionary of what we could do.
You hear stories about how some engineers just couldn't quite get the Intellivision to do what they wanted. And the reason some of the games are slower is because that understanding of that architecture is very challenging. So games could run really fast on the Intellivision. You just had to do it a certain way. And most people tried to approach programming the Intellivision like they would the Atari 2600 or an old 8-bit computer. They thought that's the way you should do it. But in fact, the Intellivision has a very specific way you should be creating games for it.
So it was made with newer technology. And with that technology, they were capable of making more resolution of backgrounds, more colors, not necessarily better colors, but more sprites. I think they could put 8 sprites on the screen.
The Intellivision itself, because they started work on it about 2 years after Atari had started work on the VCS, it had more advanced chips. And so where the Atari was using a 6502 chip, which is a very basic and because of its simplicity, a powerful chip for its time. We were using a GI 1610 chip, which had 16-bit logic in it as opposed to 8-bit. Everybody says, oh, 8-bit, 16-bit. Well, Intellivision was kind of 3 different kinds of bits. We were very confusing.
The thing is, once we programmers started doing tricks and making the Atari 2600 do things that it was not supposed to do, we ended up with more sprites than the Intellivision. I did a game called Freeway, and Freeway had 10 moving sprites on the screen.
In many cases, a lot of engineers that were on the Atari went to Intellivision and vice versa. And then many engineers that went on to third parties like Activision and whatnot would end up working on multiple platforms. So they'd work on Intellivision and Atari.
I mean, I was at a CES one day showing Pitfall, and the Intellivision programming crew came around. I remember just kind of standing behind them, and they were saying, how do you make a swinging vine that would use all 8 of our sprites? There would be nothing left for Pitfall Harry. And so the swinging vine is a trick. It's a programming trick. And without it, Pitfall doesn't exist.
All the companies in the Bay Area particularly that were working on Atari and Intellivision games were told not to intermingle, not to hang out with people from the other companies because of company secrets being let loose, and nobody wants anybody to know what everybody else is working on.
But occasionally the programmers would run into each other in the mall, and one of them would say, I finally figured out how you did that thing, you know, or whatever. So there was a little bit of interconnection.
But then hearing that they would all get together for beers at people's houses and play the games they're working on with everybody. And so it was like completely opposite of what they were asked to do. But it was a way for them all to keep sane and also to help each other out. Because once everybody was able to share what they had, even though they weren't supposed to, it really helped everybody understand like how they could improve their games and all stuff with all these great designers in the area.
As an intelligent consumer, I wanted to compare Atari asteroids with other companies' asteroids. But other companies don't make asteroids. I wanted to compare Atari Missile Command with other companies' missile commands. But other companies don't make that either. Finally, I wanted to compare the new Atari Warlords. Unfortunately, other companies don't make it. When it comes to the video games the world wants most, nobody compares to Atari.
I'll try almost anything. So when Mattel Electronics asked me to compare their Intellivision games with Atari, I gave it a try. I compared Atari baseball with Intellivision and found Intellivision played much more like real baseball. Then I compared Atari football with Intellivision. Again, Intellivision played more like the real game. In my opinion, if you try them both, there's only one conclusion you can come to. Intellivision from Mattel Electronics. I'll try almost anything. So when Mattel Electronics asked me to compare their Intellivision games with Atari, I gave it a try.
Mattel started making these commercials with George Plimpton, comparing the two systems.
He was a writer who was brought in as the spokesperson for Intellivision. He would prop up a 2600 game against an Intellivision game and just ask you, basically ask you to tell the difference.
And I think the commercials played that up. You know, as you said, the commercials, you know, implied you were high and mighty if you could afford a Intellivision and you weren't stuck down in the, you know, dregs with your Atari machine.
As a generation of kids and adults were told every night on television by our Intellivision ads, it was a clearly superior video game console.
And so you'd see this like really amazing baseball game on the Intellivision that like in our eyes back then looked like real baseball, and then you see like some blocks over on the 2600 and weird sounds coming out, and baseball talks on the Intellivision, 2600 makes beeps and that sort of thing. So they would beg you to like compare it yourself and make the decision.
I compared Atari baseball with Intellivision and found Intellivision played much more like real baseball.
Where the Intellivision, which cost $100 more than the VCS, where it excelled was in these sports games and great graphics.
Our rival television commercials for Intellivision and Atari ran each night, and inside the company we were tracking sales to see how we were doing, and it was very much competition. And of course we wanted to beat them.
Then they showed the two football games, and the Atari football I've always hated. It doesn't resemble football at all, where the Intellivision version resembles football.
Then I compared Atari football with Intellivision. Again, Intellivision played more like the real game.
The famous Atari game football was like 3-on-3 or 4-on-4, and that was a travesty to football fans. So the Intellivision felt, hey, we can at least, here's a baseball game, you got all the people on the field. Here's a football game, you have a bigger team.
Our emphasis on sports at Intellivision was just recognizing that those were the games that we were doing that people were most responding to. Most of our best sellers were our sports games. And that was the place where we were clearly beating Atari in the marketplace in terms of people's perceptions.
In my opinion, if you try them both, there's only one conclusion you can come to. Intellivision from Mattel Electronics.
The problem was they didn't have any arcade games, and Atari, being an arcade company, excelled in arcade games. And another problem with the Intellivision was it was a slower system than the VCS because it sacrificed memory for graphics rather than for speed. And so Atari retaliated with their own commercial showing this nerdy looking kid and saying, well, here's Atari's arcade games and here's Mattel's arcade games, and there are no Mattel arcade games.
As an intelligent consumer, I wanted to compare Atari asteroids with other companies' asteroids. But other companies don't make asteroids.
Atari had coin-op games that had great brands that people already knew, and that they could bring those into their home operation. We didn't have that at Mattel. And so we ended up licensing with Data East. But even then, we were doing more games that were derivative or copy type, just to try and keep pace with Atari.
I wanted to compare Atari Missile Command with other companies' missile commands, but other companies don't make that either.
Well, it probably didn't help that Intellivision came from a toy company. There's an aura there of softness, and Atari was, video gaming.
But ultimately, when you played the games, you could really tell the difference then, because the Intellivision and the way it presented graphics, the frame rate was pretty slow. It was pretty plotting, and the 2600 had this really fast frame rate. So games that were like shooters, racing games, all that stuff on the 2600 felt great, but they looked really nice on the Intellivision.
When it comes to the video games the world wants most, nobody compares to Atari.
So in a normal world, the Intellivision would have come along and blown the Atari out of the water because it seemed to have 4 times as much capability. That wasn't the reality. That was only the anticipation.
Despite all the TV commercials that Mattel ran every night for years saying how we were better, we never caught Atari in video game sales because of that price difference.
Mattel Electronics had no interest in making cartridges for the Atari 2600. What happened was this Glenn Hightower, who made the original cartridges for the Intellivision, he realized he got a bad deal out of it. Whatever games they sold to Mattel, they would get $30,000. Meanwhile, Mattel would turn around and sell like 50,000 copies of the games for a huge amount of money. And so he decided, well, why I should get in on this side. So he had his people reverse engineer the Atari 2600. They started making Atari versions of the Intellivision games.
So I remember when we were in the meeting where we were being told we were going to do this as a company, and we weren't asked, we were told.
It is hard to join a business that there's already 600 products.
Right.
And you're going to try to duplicate
and make them
one
mark.
of them. Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty hard.
Most of the executives there didn't want to do it. They said, why should we sell games for a competing system? Also, they're worried that people will look down on them, like, they're jumping on the bandwagon for another company. And then Hightower convinced them there's 10 million Atari VCSs out there, there's 2 million Intellivisions out there, So instead of selling games just for 2 million consoles, you could sell games for potentially 12 million consoles. And Mattel liked that idea, and that's why they went with it.
Once video games really started to take off and become this big boom, we had all of these copycat companies trying to come in from the outside, apart from Atari, Mattel, Activision. And everybody was trying to start a video game company. So you had Games by Apollo, which some investors started up. You had the Quaker Oats video game division. And I say that and people think, oh, Don's joking. No, there really was a Quaker Oats video game division. When you have all that kind of stuff going on and people trying to build games for Intellivision and for Atari, at a certain point, I think both companies decided, I don't know who went first or who influenced, well, we should probably be making games for each other because it's now at the point. We make games.
Mattel wants to make Atari games. Everybody has an Atari. We want to sell games. That was what they told us. Atari's everywhere, so let's make games that people will buy because of that.
As the teams evolved and kind of subdivided, one of the factors was those who had experience on 6502, which was quite a few of our programmers at that point. They tended to migrate more towards the VCS, and those who did not certainly were staying on Intellivision.
And I was hired just to do the VCS, nothing else, because I had learned machine language, in college. And the VCS runs on machine language.
Some folks just loved the Intellivision and didn't want to go anywhere. For other people, it was kind of like, oh, we get to go head to head with Atari? That would be fun.
There was that added art part too, of let's be a step above. There was definitely that concept of we're going to be above Astro Smash or whatever those other things are. We're going to be special, high society Atari.
We as a whole, as a group, both M Network and Intellivision, felt like we had really good artists. So when I think about that, what Jane is saying rings true. We were good at combining artists and programmers in a way that brought the best out in both the programmers and the artists.
I was the only woman programmer in the whole group of M Network. I was kind of unaware of how unusual it was. So we were just like a bunch of people, and we all cared about video games and the problems of the VCS and conquering it, and we would share, oh crap, my cycles went too long. I mean, it was a team thing.
Somebody told me, you know that company M Network at CES? That's Mattel. And I said, I don't think so. It doesn't make any sense. And then I found out it was. And I said, oh, okay, so they're giving up.
I just clicked this magazine. It was Electronic Games. But they had this rumor page, and they talked about how Mattel was going to start making games for the Atari 2600. I couldn't get to my friend's house fast enough to be like, victory. Like, there's no way Atari would make games for the Mattel Intellivision, which they would later.
Atari did the same thing. They made games for the Intellivision under the Atari Soft label and other systems too. So there was definitely a lot of back and forth with all these companies once they started cross-selling games across platforms.
But at the time, they were the first to concede, and so I was very excited, not because I wanted the games, which I kind of did, but because I could actually claim victory over my friends that Mattel has to make Atari games to succeed in the game business.
It was just another revenue stream. It was another revenue stream. And it was a good thing for gamers because you could play the games on whichever system you chose.
A lot of their library is based on Intellivision games, and the Intellivision was a pretty capable console. Visually it looked different from the 2600, but a lot of the games had a lot of depth to them.
The cartridge shape was basically the Intellivision cartridge, but then they had this 2600 weird adapter they plugged into it at the bottom. And so they didn't bother. They could have, if you think about it, the tooling for the adapter was probably more than enough to make an actual cartridge case, but the defiance to be like, no, we're going to make a real Intellivision cartridge and make it look and be evocative of Intellivision, even though they're using it on a 2600, I thought was a really interesting approach for them.
When I heard they were coming out with Atari games, I was in the camp that, they know that that's the market leader. We might as well jump on the bandwagon. And there were there must have been at least 2-3 dozen companies at that time producing games for the 2600. So what's another one?
The sports games were fantastic. from M Network, and I remember really liking Star Strike on the Intellivision. It felt like the sequence from Star Wars were going to the trench, and that was coming to the 2600. So secretly, I was super excited that I was going to start getting these Intellivision games on the Atari 2600.
The hyped Mattel games like Astro Smash, which became Astro Blast, I like that game. And I think it was better to play on the Atari with the joystick than it was to play on the Intellivision with the disc.
One game I played a lot of, probably more than any others, and it's a weird outlier, is Frogs and Flies, which is a port of Frog Bog. Dark Cavern, a good version of Night Stalker, which should have been my favorite. It's one of my favorites, but it was Frogs and Flies. I played a hell of a lot of Frogs and Flies.
They run the gamut as far as being good and bad, but a lot of them are based on Intellivision titles that didn't already exist on the 2600. So I think it's great that they did that.
They pushed the limits of the Atari 2600. So games like Bump and Jump or Air Raiders or even like their football and baseball games, they were pretty impressive games. They looked really close to their Intellivision counterparts, but also had their own unique look, and they had no compromises. So for a company to kind of come in and just try to cash in on the Atari craze, that isn't what it felt like. It actually felt like they were coming in here to make a difference and make really good, solid Atari 2600 games.
So I like to think that we raised the bar. And then maybe others came along and did way better, who knows? But we cracked it. We said, hey, you don't have to do the old hat stuff. You can play with it like it's an instrument. You can pluck the strings different ways.
It's been noted over the years that when there are at least 2 and sometimes 3 consoles fighting it out is when the video game business is its healthiest.
I think there were only some of the business people for whom it was war. And even though I'm the one who started saying cartridge wars, that was a turn of phrase as a metaphor as opposed to and let's draw blood. But inside the toy industry, they really did think that way. Maybe it was mid-November of '82. And so we do a demo. But the VP of marketing in his fancy suit standing there. The VP turns his head very slowly and he looks at me and he goes, "What you have to understand, young man, is that we are at war. We are at war with Atari," which tells you the attitudes of Mattel. "Every sale that we make takes something away from Atari and gives it to us. And even if I can't sell it now, I can stop somebody from buying an Atari now with this game. And that's why we're putting it on television. And you have to understand that this is a war." I don't know if I can get my eyelids as close as low as his, but so we got the speech.
To Atari, it was a console war. To Mattel's Intellivision, it was a console war. To Activision, it was an opportunity.
And as kids, we didn't care at all. I would go over friends' houses to play ColecoVision, and I was amazed. Like Donkey Kong was amazing. The controllers sucked, but the games were still a blast to play, and we just ignored that. And same thing with Intellivision. Tons of fun games in Intellivision. The controllers sucked, but we didn't care. We were having fun playing the games.
It's just ironic that there's much less of a console war now, because, I mean, how many different consoles can you play Call of Duty on? All of them? Right. So it doesn't even work that way anymore. But if you wanted to play a particular game, if you wanted to play Plimpton's baseball or whatever they called it, you had to have the Intellivision. There was no other way. And that certainly did make it a battle.
If you go back and you look at the old Intellivision and Atari commercials, and how they duel in different ways and sometimes make fun of each other and so on. You see the height of it as far as the public was concerned.
It was definitely a console war between the two console makers, but we could use any console we wanted, and in fact would occasionally do that. We would say this game would work so much better on the Intellivision, let's put it over on the Intellivision shelf and work on it when we can. So yes, there was a console war, but there were those of us who benefited from it.
I mean, Atari was so far ahead in sales, I don't think they really worried about the Intel. Maybe at first they did, but they were outselling it.
Yes, it was a war, but I think that the money was so heavily on the Atari side that, you know, Mattel was fighting a losing battle out the door.
Atari sold about 27.5 million VCSs. That's between 1977 and 1991. I don't know if that's if the numbers for the Intellivision are from just Mattel Electronics, but their total run was about 3 million.
Well, you know, they say that history goes to the victors. As the guy who coined the term console war, I would say actually that Atari won the first console war, because as much as I hate to say it, we never caught Atari in sales. We never sold as many games, we never sold as many consoles. Making money in this business is something that you have to do in order to keep making games. We're driven by passion. We have a love of making games. In the end, console wars are the business part of it. We as game makers never felt like we were at war. We're just trying to build great games that will sell.